A school teacher once wrote on his report card that he would be good only for reading the sports pages of the local newspaper, and for 21 years that verdict looked about right, as he clocked in and out of the dispatch office of a nuts and bolts factory in the Welsh Valleys. Then, at the age of 36, Leighton Rees walked onto a stage in Nottingham and became the first world darts champion in the entire history of the sport. He should have been set for life, the pioneer who helped haul darts out of the pub and onto national television. Yet he watched Eric Bristow, John Lowe and Jocky Wilson turn into wealthy household names, while his own total career earnings across everything he ever won came to just £22,000. In his last major interview before he died, he said one quiet sentence that explains the whole tragedy, and by the end of this, you will understand exactly what he meant. Leighton Thomas Rees was born on the 17th of January 1940 at a maternity home in Mountain Ash, near Pontypridd, the only son of a lorry driver named Ivor and his wife Olwen. For almost his entire life, his home was a single place, the village of Ynysybwl, tucked into the Glamorgan valleys, and by his own cheerful admission, he was no scholar. He said himself that he was only an average pupil who could never remember being gripped by any urge to learn, because his mind was fixed on rugby and sport rather than lessons. When he left Mill Street Secondary Modern at 15, that famous parting shot from his teacher followed him out of the gate, and in a strange way, it turned out to be almost prophetic, because his whole life would indeed be about sport, just not the one anyone expected. He walked straight from school into a local factory called Simmons Air Accessories, which made nuts and bolts, and settled eventually into the dispatch office, where he stayed for 21 years. Picture that timeline for a moment. A boy of 15 who does not leave until he is 36, 2 full decades in the same room in the same valley, while the world changed outside. All the while, in his lunch hours, he was quietly becoming one of the finest darts players alive. A factory team formed, based at a pub called the Collier's Arms in Porth, playing in the Pontypridd and District League, and after a couple of years there, Rees signed for the United Services Club in Ynysybwl, the same club where he had thrown his very first darts as a schoolboy, and he stayed on their books for the rest of his career. By 1970, his lunchtime habit had turned him into an international, capped for Wales for the first time, the start of a run that would eventually reach 77 caps. Recognition and invitations began pouring in, exhibitions all over the country, real money on the table, and this is where the Rees story turns in a way that makes him utterly unlike the hungry young professionals who came later. He did not want any of it. To his biographer Dave Lanning, he explained that he loved his job, his workmates, and the uncomplicated routine of his life, the simple home and his mother's cooking, and the friendly employers and the beery, boisterous social scene. He called it an odd sort of security and protection, admitted you could fairly call it humdrum, and then asked who needs fame and fortune and flashiness if you are already happy and healthy. Hold on to that, because everything that follows happens to a contented man who never actually chased the spotlight. There was one prize he genuinely dreamed about, and it broke his heart. Before the World Championship existed, the biggest title in darts was the news of the World Individual Championship, the tournament every pub player in Britain longed to win. Rees reached the grand finals in London 3 separate times, in 1970, 1974 and 1976, and each time he came up short, losing the 1976 final to Bill Leonard of Manchester. He called it every player's dream of success, and then, with real ache in the words, he called it his impossible dream, the one thing he wanted most in a sport he would go on to conquer, and the one thing he never managed to hold. His path to fame ran through a television producer with sharp instincts. In 1972, Sid Waddell of Yorkshire Television started hearing about a cluster of brilliant players in the South Wales valleys, 3 names in particular: Tony Ridler of Newport, Alan Evans of the Rhondda, and Leighton Rees of Ynysybwl. Waddell brought all 3 onto his pub games programme, the Indoor League, hosted by the former England cricketer Fred Trueman. And here comes the loveliest detail of the whole story. Ridler and Evans went on air and threw big scores and maximums, exactly the fireworks you would expect to make an impression, while Rees, by his own account, did not even play especially well that first year. He stole the show anyway. Sitting there with a lager and a cigar, in that dry, unhurried Welsh voice, he told Fred Trueman stories about how he and Alan Evans used to hustle the English out of their money, and the nation fell for him on the spot. He went on to become the most successful darts player in the entire history of that program, the only man ever to win its darts tournament twice, in 1974 and again in 1976. That success finally pulled him out of the factory, though not on his own initiative. His manager Eddie Norman and his Welsh teammate and close friend Alan Evans talked him into turning professional in 1976 at the age of 36, remarkably late in a sport already filling up with younger men. It took him barely a year to prove them right. In December 1977, at the Wembley Conference Centre in London, Rees led Wales to victory in the first ever World Cup and won the individual singles title at the same event, beating Cliff Lazarenko in the final. Best player at the inaugural World Cup and a champion with his country, and the biggest night of his life was now just 2 months away. It arrived at the heart of the Midlands Club in Nottingham across the first 10 days of February 1978 at the very first World Professional Darts Championship. The total prize fund for this piece of history was £10,500. Seeded third, Rees opened by crushing the Australian Barry Atkinson 6-0, and then the draw handed him the match that would change the sport, a second-round meeting with his own countryman, teammate and friend Alan Evans. Both men averaged over 90 per free darts, which in 1978 was almost unheard of, and after Evans surged ahead early with a pair of maximums, Rees answered with a 10-dart finish, the first of the championship and the first ever thrown in front of live television cameras. He came through it 6-3, and the BBC's executive producer, Nick Hunter, later called it the match that made darts live up to everything they had hoped for, the game that locked it in as a national television event for years to come. Two Welshmen from two mining valleys, and between them they made darts. The rest of that tournament tested a different set of muscles. In the semi-final, Rees had to grind past a stubborn American named Ynysybwl by 8-7, the marathon man doing exactly what his nickname promised, refusing to fold in a long fight. That put him into the final against another good friend, John Lowe. Rees averaged over 90 once again, and from 8-7 he found a 180 and a 13-dart leg to pull clear to 9-7, then closed out the next two as well. 11-7, and Leighton Rees, the Storman from Ynysybwl, was the first world darts champion in history. He collected a cheque for £3,000, and back home, the local council named a street after him, Leighton Rees Close, which still stands in the village today. He had reached the summit, and here is the cruelty at the centre of his life. He reached it about 4 years too early. In 1979, he returned to the final, beating Alan Evans on the way once more, but this time, John Lowe whitewashed him 5-0, and from there, the decline set in. A quarter-final in 1980, a second round in 1981, and then a run of first-round exits in 1982, 83, 85, 87 and 1990, the last of them a defeat to Eric Bristow, 9 World Championship appearances in total, producing 1 title, 1 runner-up, and then years of walking out early. Meanwhile, the sport exploded around him, prize money climbing, new tournaments appearing across British television, and Bristow, Lowe and Wilson turning into genuine celebrities with the sponsorship deals and the earnings to match. And Leighton Rees, the first champion the sport, ever crowned, finished his entire career with total prize money of £22,875. He built the stage, he turned the key, he opened the door on the television age, and then he found himself standing on the wrong side of it. So he worked, because there were no player pensions in darts back then, no safety net and no retirement fund, and a trophy on the mantelpiece does not pay a mortgage. Rees made his living on the exhibition circuit, and he made it mostly alongside Alan Evans, the two friends from the two valleys driving through the night to working men's clubs and civic halls, playing the locals and doing the trick shots and taking the cash. He was wonderful at it, and he stayed genuinely beloved, his matches filling arenas even in the late 80s when he was going out in the first round of the Worlds. One story from this stretch captures the warm, strange world these men lived in perfectly. In 1980, while competing at a tournament in Las Vegas, Rees married a Californian woman named Debbie Ryle, and the best man at the wedding was none other than Eric Bristow. The circuit that kept him afloat also ran on the culture of the British pub, the smoke and the drink and the late nights, night after night, for well over a decade, and slowly it wore him down. By the 1990s, his heart was failing. He had a pacemaker fitted, he underwent heart bypass surgery, and he had a further heart operation in 2001. The pacemaker forced him to give up the exhibition work, which meant giving up the last modest income he had left, so the very thing that had sustained him became the thing he could no longer do. He had already retired from competitive darts in 1991, and in the year before his death, they brought him back to the World Championship stage one final time, not to play, but to make the tournament draw, the first champion returning to the game that had long since grown beyond him. Then, in 2002, he sat down for what became his last major interview with John Lowe. the very man he had beaten in that first final 24 years earlier and still counted as a friend. Lowe asked him about his career, and Rees said he would not change a thing before adding the sentence that says everything. He said that if only he had owned a crystal ball at the time, he would have looked after his health and his money very differently. That is the whole story in a single line, spoken by the man who lived it. Leighton Rees died on the 8th of June 2003 at the Royal Glamorgan Hospital in Lantressant of a long-standing heart condition at the age of 63, and he was survived by his wife Debbie and their son Ryan, with Debbie passing away 4 years later. Weigh up what he was, and the contrast is almost unbearable. He never wanted the fame and said so plainly, happy in his factory with his mates and his routine and his lunch break dartboard, until a friend and a manager talked him onto the professional stage. Within 2 years, he was champion of the world. He never won the News of the World, the one title he actually dreamed of, and he never got the money, and he watched 3 other men grow rich and famous on the stage he had helped to build. Yet in 2007, Leighton Rees became the first British darts player ever included in the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography, a reference work The Telegraph once called the greatest on earth, an honour for the boy whose teacher said he would be good only for reading the sports pages. Every player who walks out at the World Championship today, competing for prize funds Rees could never have imagined, is walking through a door that a storeman from Ynysybwl opened first. He was the first champion of them all, and he deserves to be remembered like it. If this is the first time you've heard his name, then that is exactly the problem, so subscribe and help us keep the first champion where he belongs.